The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota plains as Sarah, running bare, walked carefully along the creek bed, her worn moccasins silent on the rocky ground. At 17, she had learned to move like her grandmother taught her, with respect for the earth and awareness of every sound around her. The reservation had been her world for all these years, but lately, it felt more like a cage than a home. Her younger brother Tommy had been sick for 3 weeks now, burning with fever that wouldn't break despite all the traditional remedies their grandmother knew. The tribal clinic had run out of the medicine he needed, and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away in town. Sarah's mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on their table, and their father had left when Tommy was still a baby. There was no money for hospital bills, no car that could make the long journey, and no relatives with means to help. Sarah carried a small woven basket, hoping to find some of the healing herbs that grew wild along the water. Her grandmother had taught her which plants could help with fever, but nothing seemed to work for Tommy anymore. She knelt beside a cluster of echinacea, carefully harvesting only what she needed while whispering the prayers of gratitude her grandmother had taught her. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance reminded her that she was close to the edge of the Blackwood Ranch. The Blackwood family owned thousands of acres that bordered the reservation, land that had once belonged to her people before the government took it away decades ago. Sarah had never seen any of the Blackwoods up close, though she knew the stories. They were wealthy white ranchers who kept to themselves and didn't mix with the tribal community. As she worked, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of men's voices, rough and aggressive, coming closer through the brush. She quickly gathered her basket and tried to move away from the sound, but her heart sank as she realized she was trapped. The creek had carved a deep channel here, with steep banks on both sides. The only way out was the path she had come down, and the voices were coming from that direction. "I know she came this way," one man was saying, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Little Indian girl thinks she can just walk onto our land like she owns it." Sarah recognized the voice of Dale Morrison, a drifter who had been causing trouble around the area for months. He and his friends had a reputation for harassing anyone they considered an outsider, especially young women from the reservation. Sarah pressed herself against the creek bank, hoping the men would pass by without seeing her. "Maybe we should teach her a lesson about trespassing," another voice suggested with a cruel laugh. "Show her what happens to her kind when they don't stay where they belong." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized they were talking about her. She had been careful to stay on reservation land, but the boundaries were sometimes unclear near the creek. Even if she had accidentally crossed onto ranch property, it didn't give these men the right to threaten her. She clutched her basket tightly, thinking of Tommy waiting at home, burning with fever while she searched desperately for anything that might help him. The voices grew louder, and Sarah knew they had spotted her tracks. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The creek bank was too steep to climb quickly, and the water was too shallow to offer any protection. She had heard too many stories of what men like Morrison did to young women they caught alone, and fear made her mouth go dry. "There she is." Morrison's voice rang out triumphantly, down by the creek like a little animal. Sarah looked up to see 3 men standing at the top of the bank, looking down at her with expressions that made her stomach turn. Morrison was in the center, a big man with dirty clothes and bloodshot eyes. His companions were smaller, but no less threatening, both wearing the same cruel smiles. "Please," Sarah called up to them, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just gathering medicine for my sick brother." Morrison laughed harshly. "Medicine? You mean stealing our plants? That's theft, girl. And we know how to deal with thieves around here." The men started down the bank, moving slowly and deliberately like wolves stalking their prey. Sarah backed up until she felt the cold creek water soaking through her moccasins, but there was nowhere else to go. The bank behind her was just as steep, and she could never climb it fast enough to escape. "My brother is very sick," Sarah tried again, holding up her basket to show the small handful of herbs she had gathered. "These plants grow everywhere. I only took what I needed, and I made sure to leave the roots so they would grow back." "That's real nice," Morrison said, still advancing down the bank with his friends close behind. "But the thing is, you're on our land now, and there's a price to pay for that." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her grandmother had always told her to be strong, to face whatever came with dignity and courage. But She was only 17, alone, and outnumbered by grown men who clearly meant her harm. "What do you want?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Morrison's grin widened, showing yellow teeth. "Well now, that depends on how cooperative you want to be. We can make this easy, or we can make it hard. Your choice." Sarah's mind raced, looking for any possible escape. The creek was too shallow to hide in, the banks too steep to climb quickly, and the men were already too close. She thought of her mother, working double shifts to support their family. She thought of Tommy, burning with fever in his small bed. She thought of her grandmother's stories about the strength of Lakota women, how they had survived impossible hardships and protected their families no matter what. "Please," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. "Someone help." The words echoed off the creek banks, seeming to mock her with their futility. There was no one around for miles except these 3 men who meant her harm. The reservation was too far away for anyone to hear her, and the ranch buildings were empty during the day while the cowboys worked the distant pastures. Morrison reached the bottom of the creek bank and started walking toward her through the shallow water. His boots made splashing sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. His friends spread out on either side, cutting off any possible escape route. "Nobody's going to help you out here, girl," Morrison said softly, his voice taking on a tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "It's just you and us, and this nice private spot where nobody will bother us." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, sending up a prayer to her ancestors, to the spirits of the land, to anyone who might be listening. She opened them again and straightened her shoulders, determined not to show these men her fear, even if she couldn't escape them. "I am Sarah Running Bear," she said clearly, using the strength in her grandmother's voice. "Daughter of Marie Running Bear, granddaughter of Eleanor Crow Feather. I am Lakota, and I am not afraid of cowards who threaten young women." Morrison's face darkened with anger at her defiance. "We'll see about that," he snarled, reaching out toward her. But just as his hand was about to grab her arm, the sound of hoofbeats thundered down from the top of the creek bank. Morrison spun around in surprise as a horse, and Ryder plunged down the steep slope in a cascade of loose dirt and rocks. The rider was a tall man in worn jeans and a faded work shirt, his face shadowed by the brim of a cowboy hat. His horse was a powerful bay gelding that moved with the sure-footed grace of an animal used to rough terrain. The man's jaw was set with grim determination, and his eyes blazed with controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. "Get away from her," the rider commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. His horse slid to a stop between Sarah and her attackers, spraying creek water in all directions. Morrison stepped back in surprise, but quickly recovered his composure. "This ain't your business, mister. Just a little misunderstanding between us and the girl here." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the creek bed with a solid splash. He was taller than Morrison and lean in the way of someone who did hard physical work every day. There was something familiar about his face, though Sarah couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "I said get away from her," the rider repeated, his voice deadly quiet now. "This is Blackwood land, and I don't tolerate this kind of behavior anywhere on it." Sarah's heart sank as she realized this man was probably one of the wealthy ranchers her grandmother had warned her about. He might save her from Morrison and his friends, but only to claim her for himself. She had heard stories about what some of the white landowners expected from young Indian women they found on their property. But something in the rider's voice gave her hope. There was genuine anger there, directed not at her, but at the men who had threatened her. He positioned himself squarely between Sarah and Morrison, his stance relaxed but ready for trouble. "Look, Blackwood," Morrison said, and Sarah realized with surprise that this stranger was actually one of the family who owned the vast ranch. "We were just having a conversation with a girl about trespassing. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything that happens on my land concerns me," the man replied evenly. "And what I see here isn't a conversation. It's 3 grown men threatening a young woman who's done nothing wrong." One of Morrison's companions, emboldened by their numbers, stepped forward. She was stealing plants, gathering stuff without permission. "We caught her red-handed." The rancher glanced back at Sarah's basket, taking in the small collection of common herbs. When he looked at her face, Sarah was surprised to see not suspicion, but compassion in his eyes. "Is her brother really sick?" he asked gently, and Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. The rancher turned back to Morrison, his expression hardening. Then, she was doing what any sister would do. These plants grow wild everywhere, and there's no harm in gathering a few for medicine. You three, on the other hand, are trespassing on my property with clear intent to harm this young woman. Morrison's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. You're taking the side of some Indian girl over your own kind? I'm taking the side of what's right, the rancher said firmly. And what you were planning to do is very wrong. I suggest you leave my land immediately, and don't let me catch you bothering anyone else. The three men exchanged glances, clearly wanting to argue, but recognizing they were outmatched. The rancher wore a gun on his hip with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it, and his whole demeanor suggested he wouldn't hesitate to protect Sarah if necessary. This isn't over, Morrison muttered as he started back toward the creek bank. His friends followed reluctantly, shooting hostile glances back at both Sarah and her unlikely protector. The rancher waited until all three men had climbed out of the creek and disappeared over the ridge before turning back to Sarah. She stood frozen in the shallow water, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice gentle now that the threat was gone. Sarah shook her head, still clutching her basket of herbs. No, I thank you. You saved me. The rancher's expression was serious as he studied her face. What's your name? Sarah Running Bear, she answered, the same way she had introduced herself to Morrison, but without the defiant edge this time. I'm Jack Blackwood, the rancher said, and you don't need to thank me for doing what any decent person would do. He paused, looking at the herbs in her basket again. Your brother, how sick is he? Sarah felt tears threatening again, but this time from relief rather than fear. Very sick. He's had a high fever for weeks, and nothing we try seems to help. The clinic on the reservation doesn't have the medicine he needs. Jack frowned, and Sarah could see him thinking. How old is he? 8, Sarah whispered. He's just 8 years old, and I'm so scared. The words came out in a rush, all her fear and worry spilling over now that she felt safe enough to show her emotions. Jack's expression softened even more. What about a doctor? Have you been able to get him to a hospital? Sarah shook her head, ashamed to admit their poverty to this wealthy man. We don't have a car, and the hospital is very far away. My mother works 2 jobs, but there's never enough money for emergencies. Jack was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if he was judging her family for their circumstances. But when he spoke, his voice was filled with determination rather than condemnation. Come on, he said, extending his hand to help her up the creek bank. Let's get you and your brother to that hospital. Sarah stared at Jack Blackwood in disbelief, her heart still racing from the encounter with Morrison and his men. The offer seemed too good to be true, like something from one of the stories her grandmother told about spirits who appeared to help people in their darkest moments. You would do that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You would help us? Jack nodded without hesitation. A sick child needs medical attention, regardless of who his family is or where they come from. That's not a matter of charity. It's just human decency. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She had learned not to show weakness, especially to strangers, but Jack's kindness was overwhelming after the terror she had just experienced. I need to go home first, she said, gesturing toward the direction of the reservation. To get Tommy and tell my mother what's happening. Of course, Jack agreed. I'll drive you. He whistled softly, and his horse raised its head from where it had been drinking from the creek. Can you ride? Sarah nodded. Growing up on the reservation, she had learned to ride almost before she could walk, though her family had never owned a horse of their own. Jack boosted her up onto the bay gelding's back, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. As they rode toward the reservation, Sarah became acutely aware of the differences between her world and Jack's. Her worn clothes and secondhand shoes seemed shabby compared to his well-made boots and quality hat. The reservation houses that came into view were small and weathered, many needing repairs that their occupants couldn't afford. She wondered what Jack thought as he saw how her people lived, whether he looked down on them the way so many others did. But when she glanced back at his face, she saw only concern and determination. He wasn't judging her home or her family. He was focused entirely on getting help for a sick little boy he had never even met. There, Sarah said, pointing to a small house with faded blue paint and a sagging front porch. That's where we live. Jack guided the horse to a stop in front of the house, and they both dismounted. Sarah could hear coughing from inside, Tommy's cough that had been getting worse every day. Her mother's voice followed, speaking softly in Lakota as she tried to comfort her son. "Mama," Sarah called as she pushed open the front door. "I'm home, and I brought someone to help." Marie Running Bear emerged from the back bedroom, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She was a small woman who worked as a cleaning lady at the school and a waitress at the diner in town, often putting in 16-hour days to support her family. Her eyes widened when she saw the tall white man standing behind her daughter. "Sarah, what's going on?" Marie asked in English, her voice cautious but polite. "This is Jack Blackwood," Sarah explained quickly. "He helped me when some men were bothering me by the creek. And when he heard about Tommy being sick, he offered to drive us to the hospital." Marie's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. She had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially from wealthy white people who usually wanted nothing to do with reservation families. "We can't pay for a hospital visit," she said directly, her chin raised with pride despite their desperate circumstances. "We don't take charity." Jack removed his hat respectfully, holding it in his hands as he addressed Sarah's mother. "Mrs. Running Bear, I understand your concerns, and I respect your independence. But your son is seriously ill, and the nearest medical care is an hour away. I have a truck, and I have the time to drive you there. That's all I'm offering, transportation to get your boy the help he needs." A particularly harsh, coughing fit from the bedroom emphasized Jack's words. Marie's resolve wavered as she listened to her son's labored breathing. "Let me see him first," she said, leading them toward the back of the house. Tommy Running Bear was lying in a small bed covered with one of his grandmother's quilts. At 8 years old, he was small for his age, and the fever had made him even thinner and more fragile-looking. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. When he opened his eyes to look at the visitors, Jack could see that the boy was very ill indeed. "Hey there, partner," Jack said gently, crouching down beside the bed. "I'm Jack. Your sister tells me you've been feeling pretty rough." Tommy nodded weakly, too sick to be shy around the stranger. "My chest hurts," he whispered, "and I'm so hot, but I can't stop shivering." Jack placed a careful hand on the boy's forehead and felt the burning heat of the fever. He had helped with enough sick cattle to recognize the signs of serious infection, and every instinct told him that Tommy needed professional medical attention immediately. "Mrs. Running Bear," he said, standing up to face Sarah's mother. "I'm not a doctor, but I've seen enough illness to know that your son needs help we can't give him here. Please let me drive you to the hospital." Marie looked down at her son, then at Sarah, then back at Jack. The struggle between pride and desperation played out clearly on her face. Finally, love for her children won over her distrust of strangers. "All right," she said quietly, "but we pay our own way once we get there, whatever it costs." "Understood," Jack agreed. "Let's get Tommy ready to travel." Marie gathered a few things while Jack and Sarah carefully wrapped Tommy in blankets. The boy was so weak that Jack ended up carrying him to the truck, a new Ford pickup that looked out of place in the humble surroundings of the reservation. The drive to the hospital took nearly an hour over rough roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Jack drove as smoothly as possible to avoid jostling Tommy, but the boy whimpered with each bump and pothole. Marie sat in the back seat holding her son, speaking to him softly in Lakota while Sarah held his hand from the front seat. "How long has he been like this?" Jack asked during a quiet moment. 3 weeks, Marie answered, her voice tight with worry. "It started as a cold, but then the fever came and never went away. The clinic gave us some medicine, but it didn't help." "Has he been eating?" "Hardly anything for the past week. Just sips of water and maybe a little broth." Jack pressed a little harder on the accelerator, understanding now just how serious Tommy's condition had become. Dehydration and prolonged fever in a child could become life-threatening very quickly. The hospital was a modern building that stood out starkly against the small farming town that surrounded it. Jack pulled up to the emergency entrance and jumped out to get a wheelchair while Marie and Sarah carefully lifted Tommy from the truck. The emergency room was busy with the usual mix of farming accidents and minor emergencies that characterized rural hospitals. A tired-looking nurse at the reception desk glanced up as they approached with Tommy in the wheelchair. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, but her tone changed immediately when she saw the sick child. Medical professionals could recognize serious illness just as quickly as experienced ranchers could. High fever for 3 weeks, Marie explained. He's barely eating, and his breathing is getting worse. Let's get him back to her room right away, the nurse said, standing up and calling for assistance. She looked at the small group accompanying Tommy. Are you all family? I'm his mother, and this is his sister, Marie said. This man gave us a ride here. The nurse nodded and looked at Jack with appreciation. Good thing you did. This boy needs immediate attention. As the medical staff took over Tommy's care, Jack found himself in the unusual position of waiting in a hospital lobby with 2 members of family he had met only hours ago. Sarah sat beside her mother, both of them watching the door where Tommy had disappeared with wide, frightened eyes. Thank you, Marie said suddenly, turning to look at Jack. I don't know why you're helping us, but I want you to know how grateful we are. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure why he had gotten so involved either. He had acted on instinct when he saw Sarah in danger, and then one thing had led to another. But sitting here now, watching a mother's quiet terror as she waited for news about her son, he knew he had done the right thing. Any parent would have done the same thing, he said simply. No, Sarah spoke up for the first time since they had arrived. Not everyone would have helped. Most people look at us and see problems they don't want to deal with. Jack turned to study Sarah's face, seeing a maturity there that seemed older than her 17 years. Is that what you expected from me? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I didn't know what to expect. When I first saw you, I thought you might be just like Morrison and his friends, only with more power to hurt us. What changed your mind? The way you looked at Tommy, Sarah said softly. Like he mattered, like he was worth saving, not because of who his family is or where he comes from, but just because he's a sick little boy who needs help. Before Jack could respond, a doctor in green scrubs emerged from the treatment area and approached their small group. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the slightly harried look of someone who worked long hours in a busy rural hospital. Mrs. Running Bear? He asked, and Marie stood up immediately. Yes, that's me. How's my son? Tommy is very sick, the doctor said gently. He has pneumonia, which explains the fever and breathing problems. But we caught it in time, and with proper treatment, he should make a full recovery. Marie's knees nearly gave out with relief, and Sarah had to steady her with a firm hand on her arm. What kind of treatment does he need? Marie asked, though Jack could hear the worry in her voice about what such treatment might cost. We need to admit him to the hospital for at least a week, the doctor explained. He'll need intravenous antibiotics and fluids to get his strength back. The fever should break within the next day or 2 once we get the right medication in his system. A week in the hospital, Marie repeated faintly, and Jack could practically see her calculating costs that she knew her family couldn't afford. Doctor, Jack said, standing up and extending his hand. I'm Jack Blackwood. I brought the family here. What's the typical cost for this kind of treatment? The doctor shook Jack's hand and named a figure that made Marie's face go pale. It represented more money than their family saw in 6 months. Money they simply didn't have. We have payment plans, the doctor said kindly, clearly recognizing their financial situation. And there's some assistance programs that might help. That won't be necessary, Jack said quietly. I'll take care of the bill. Marie spun around to face him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of gratitude and anger. Mr. Blackwood, we can't accept that kind of help from you. We barely know you. Mrs. Running Bear, Jack said gently, your son almost died today because he couldn't get medical care when he needed it. No child should suffer because his family can't afford a doctor. Please let me help. But why? Marie asked, her voice breaking slightly. Why would you do this for strangers? What do you want from us? Jack was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer a question he wasn't sure he fully understood himself. The truth was complex and probably wouldn't make complete sense to anyone, including himself. My father built our ranch by taking advantage of people who couldn't fight back, he said finally. He bought land from families who were desperate, paid wages that kept workers poor, and generally made his fortune by stepping on anyone who got his way. I inherited his wealth, but I don't want to inherit his legacy. He paused, looking at Sarah and her mother with complete sincerity. Maybe helping your family is a small way of trying to balance the scales. Or maybe it's just the right thing to do. I don't need a complicated reason to help a sick child. Marie studied his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motives. Finally, she nodded slowly. All right, she said, but this is a loan, not charity. I'll pay you back, even if it takes years. If that's what you need to feel comfortable accepting help, then that's what we'll call it, Jack agreed. Now, would you like to see Tommy? The doctor says you can sit with him while he sleeps. As they followed the doctor back to Tommy's room, Sarah found herself walking beside Jack. She couldn't help but steal glances at this man who had turned her family's world upside down in the space of a few hours. Why didn't you just drive away? She asked quietly. After you saved me from Morrison, you could have just left. Jack considered the question as they walked down the hospital corridor. I guess because saving you from those men was only half the job. You were in danger because you were trying to help your brother, and until he was safe, you weren't really safe either. It was a perspective that Sarah had never considered, but it made sense in a way that touched her deeply. This stranger had seen the complete picture of her family's crisis and had committed himself to seeing it through to the end. Tommy's room was small, but clean, with large windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. The boy looked tiny in the hospital bed, dwarfed by all the medical equipment surrounding him. But his breathing was already easier thanks to the oxygen mask covering his face. The 4 will help with the dehydration, the nurse explained as she checked Tommy's chart. And we've started him on a broad-spectrum antibiotic that should start fighting the infection right away. Marie took a seat beside the bed and reached through the bed rails to take her son's small hand in both of hers. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope that Tommy was going to be all right. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, watching her brother's chest rise and fall with each breath. The nightmare that had started with her desperate search for healing herbs seemed to be turning into something else entirely. A story of unexpected kindness from the most unlikely source. Jack remained near the doorway, not wanting to intrude on the family's private moment, but reluctant to leave until he was sure everything was settled. He found himself thinking about the events of the day, wondering how a routine ride to check on his cattle had led him to a hospital room where he had just committed to paying thousands of dollars for the medical care of a child he had never met before today. The rational part of his mind suggested that he was being foolish, that his responsibility ended with bringing the family to the hospital. But looking at Tommy's small face and his mother's exhausted relief, Jack knew he had made the right choice, regardless of how complicated it might make his life going forward. 3 days passed before Tommy's fever finally broke. Sarah had spent most of that time at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, and leaving only when the nurses insisted she go to the cafeteria to eat something. Her mother had to return to work after the first day. They couldn't afford to lose both of her jobs, but she came by every evening after her shifts ended. Jack had surprised them both by returning to the hospital each morning with coffee and breakfast for Sarah, and each evening to check on Tommy's progress. He never stayed long or made a big show of his visits, but his consistent presence became a source of comfort that Sarah hadn't expected. On the morning that Tommy woke up clear-eyed and asking for pancakes, Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The little boy who had been so close to death was sitting up in bed, complaining about the hospital gown and wanting to know when he could go home. Soon, the doctor promised with a smile as he examined Tommy's chest with his stethoscope. Your lungs sound much clearer, and your fever has been gone for 12 hours. If you continue improving at this rate, we might be able to discharge you tomorrow. Sarah was alone with Tommy when Jack arrived for his morning visit. Her brother was coloring in a book that one of the nurses had brought him, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on staying within the lines. Hey there, partner, Jack said, settling into the chair beside Sarah. You're looking a lot better today. Tommy looked up from his coloring book and grinned. Sarah told me you're the one who brought us here. Thank you for helping my sister and Mama. You're very welcome, Jack replied. How are you feeling? Much better. The doctor says the bad stuff in my lungs is almost gone. Tommy studied Jack with the direct gaze that children sometimes used. Are you really a cowboy? Jack chuckled. I suppose I am. I raise cattle on a ranch not too far from your home. Do you have horses? Lots of them. Maybe when you're all better, you and Sarah could come visit and see them. Tommy's eyes lit up with excitement, but Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had been wondering for 3 days what Jack expected in return for his help, and now she worried that the invitation to his ranch might come with strings attached that would put her family in an uncomfortable position. As if sensing her thoughts, Jack turned to look at her directly. Sarah, would you walk with me for a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you about something. Sarah's anxiety increased, but she nodded and followed Jack out into the hallway. They walked in silence until they reached a small waiting area near the elevators, away from the bustle of the main corridor. "What did you want to talk about?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack leaned against the window, looking out at the town below. "I've been thinking about what happens after Tommy is discharged. The doctor says he'll need to take antibiotics for another 2 weeks and come back for a follow-up visit. That's another trip to town, more time away from work for your mother." Sarah nodded, having worried about the same things. "We'll figure it out. We always do." "I'm sure you will," Jack said. "But I have an idea that might make things easier for your family, if you're interested in hearing it." "What kind of idea?" Jack turned to face her fully. "I need help at the ranch. My regular housekeeper is getting older and can't handle all the work anymore, and I've been looking for someone to help with cooking and cleaning. The job comes with a house on the property. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable. Your mother could work for me, and you, and Tommy could live there too. It would put you closer to town for medical appointments, and Tommy could attend the school here, which is probably better than what's available on the reservation." Sarah stared at him in shock. The offer was generous beyond anything she had imagined, but it also felt overwhelming and slightly suspicious. "Why would you offer us something like that?" she asked. "You barely know us." "That's true," Jack admitted. "But I know enough to see that your mother is a hard worker who's doing her best in difficult circumstances. And I know that you're someone who's willing to risk her own safety to help her family. Those are the kinds of people I want around me." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications of what he was suggesting. Living and working on Jack's ranch would solve many of their immediate problems, but it would also mean leaving the reservation, leaving her grandmother and the community that had raised her. "What about our house? Our grandmother? Your grandmother would be welcome to visit any time, and you could go see her whenever you wanted. As for your house, you could keep it or rent it out or whatever makes the most sense for your family. And you don't want anything else?" Sarah asked, the words coming out sharper than she had intended. "Just honest work for honest pay." Jack's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I understand why you would be suspicious. You've probably heard stories about men in my position taking advantage of women in your mother's situation. All I can tell you is that I'm not that kind of man. You would be employees, nothing more and nothing less. If you ever felt uncomfortable or wanted to leave, you could do so immediately, no questions asked." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She had learned to read people carefully over the years, and everything about Jack's expression and body language suggested that he was being completely honest with her. "I want you to talk to my mother," she said finally. "Of course. And Sarah, there's no pressure here. If this doesn't feel right for your family, just say no. It won't change anything about Tommy's medical care or my willingness to help." When Marie arrived at the hospital that evening after her shift at the diner, Sarah pulled her aside to explain Jack's offer. Her mother listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing of what she was thinking. "What do you think about it?" Marie asked when Sarah had finished explaining. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "It sounds almost too good to be true, but he seems sincere, and it would solve a lot of our problems." Marie was quiet for several minutes, staring at Tommy as he slept peacefully in his hospital bed. "Your grandmother always said that sometimes the spirits send help in unexpected forms," she said finally. "Maybe this is one of those times. So, you want to consider it? I want to meet with Mr. Blackwood, and hear his offer directly. If he's serious about giving us honest work and a fair wage, then maybe it's worth trying." The next morning, Jack returned to find both Marie and Sarah waiting for him in the hospital lobby. Tommy had been discharged an hour earlier and was back in their reservation house under the care of his grandmother, while Marie came to town for this conversation. They found a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria to talk, and Jack repeated his offer in detail, answering all of Marie's careful questions about wages, working conditions, and living arrangements. "The house has 3 bedrooms," he explained. "It's about a mile from a main ranch house, so you'd have privacy, but still be close enough to work. The pay is competitive with what you're making now, but you'd only have 1 job instead of 2, and there would be benefits including health insurance." Marie's eyes widened at the mention of health insurance. That alone would be worth more than the difference in wages. "What kind of work would Sarah do?" Marie asked. "Whatever she's interested in," Jack replied. "She could help around the house, or work with the horses, or focus on her schooling. I know she's smart. Any girl who can speak for her family the way she did when we first met has a good education ahead of her, if she wants it." "I dropped out of high school," Sarah said quietly. When Mama started working 2 jobs, someone needed to take care of Tommy and help Grandma. The high school in town has programs for students who need to make up credits, Jack said. You could finish your diploma and even think about college if that's something you want to pursue. Sarah felt her heart race at the thought. She had given up on the idea of finishing school, but the possibility of getting her diploma and maybe even going to college seemed like a dream she had never dared to imagine. I need some time to think about this, Marie said, and I want to see the house and meet your other employees before I make a decision. That's fair, Jack agreed. Why don't you come out to the ranch tomorrow morning? I'll show you around and introduce you to everyone. If you decide you're interested, you could start work on Monday. That evening, the Running Bear family held a long discussion around their kitchen table. Sarah's grandmother listened carefully as Marie and Sarah described Jack's offer, occasionally asking questions or offering observations in Lakota. He could be lying, grandmother said practically. Men with power sometimes make promises they don't intend to keep. That's true, Marie agreed. But if he is lying, we'll find out quickly enough, and we can always come back here. What does your heart tell you about this man? Grandmother asked Sarah directly. Sarah thought carefully before answering. I think he's someone who's trying to do right by us. I don't know why, but I believe he means what he says. Grandmother nodded slowly. Sometimes the earth shifts, and we must be ready to move with it or be left behind. This might be one of those times. The next morning, Jack picked up Marie and Sarah in his truck and drove them out to the Blackwood Ranch. Sarah had seen parts of the ranch before from a distance, but she had never imagined the scope of the operation. Thousands of acres of grassland stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle and crossed by streams that provided water for the herds. The ranch house itself was impressive but not ostentatious. A large, comfortable home built from local stone and timber that looked like it had grown naturally from the landscape around it. The employee houses were scattered across the property, each with its own small yard and garden space. The house Jack showed them was perfect for their needs. It had a large kitchen, a comfortable living room, and 3 bedrooms that were bigger than any rooms in their current home. The furniture was simple but well-made, and everything was clean and in good repair. Mrs. Chun was my previous housekeeper, Jack explained as they toured the main ranch house. She's moving to California to live with her daughter, but she's agreed to stay for a week to train whoever takes her place. Mrs. Chun turned out to be a cheerful woman in her 60s who immediately put Marie at ease by asking practical questions about her experience and explaining the daily routines of the household. There was nothing condescending in her manner, and she treated Marie as a professional colleague rather than someone to be pitied. The other ranch employees they met were equally welcoming. The foreman, a weathered man named Pete Rodriguez, tipped his hat respectfully to both women and told Sarah that his daughter was about her age and attended the local high school. It's a good school, he assured her. They'll help you get caught up and work with your schedule if you need to help out around here sometimes. By the time Jack drove them home that afternoon, both Marie and Sarah had made up their minds. The opportunity was too good to pass up, even if it meant leaving the comfort and familiarity of the reservation. We'll take the job, Marie told Jack as he walked them to their front door. When do you want us to start? Monday morning, Jack replied. I'll help you move your things over the weekend. As Sarah watched Jack drive away, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the changes coming to her family's life. In the space of a week, they had gone from desperate poverty to financial stability, from a dying child to a healthy one, from a hopeless situation to one filled with possibility. She found herself thinking about the moment in the creek when she had cried out for help, never expecting that anyone would hear or care enough to respond. Sometimes, she realized, help came from the most unexpected places and in forms you never could have imagined. Tommy was waiting for her on the front porch, fully recovered and excited about the prospect of living on a real ranch with horses and cattle. His brush with serious illness seemed to have given him a new appreciation for every day, and he chattered constantly about all the things he wanted to see and do in his new home. Do you think Mr. Jack will really let me ride the horses? He asked for the 10th time that day. I think Mr. Jack is a man who keeps his promises, Sarah replied, and she realized that she truly believed it. That night, as her family packed their belongings and prepared for a new chapter in their lives, Sarah found herself thinking about the threads that connected people across the barriers of race and class and circumstance. A week ago, she would never have imagined that a wealthy white rancher could become not just an ally, but a genuine friend to her family. The world was full of terrible people like Morrison and his friends, people who saw others as less than human and treated them accordingly. But it was also full of people like Jack Blackwood, people who were willing to see past differences and respond to human need with human kindness. As she folded her few clothes and placed them in a cardboard box, Sarah allowed herself to dream about the future in ways she never had before. High school graduation, college, a career that would let her help other families facing the kinds of struggles her own family had endured. For the first time in her life, those dreams seemed possible rather than foolish. The morning they moved to the ranch, Sarah stood for a moment at the edge of the reservation, looking back at the small house where she had grown up. She would return to visit her grandmother regularly, and this land would always be part of who she was. But she was also ready to step forward into whatever came next, trusting in the kindness of a stranger who had become something much more important in the space of a few days. Tommy raced ahead toward their new home, shouting with excitement about everything he saw. Marie walked beside Sarah, carrying the small bundle of Tommy's medical supplies and wearing an expression of cautious hope that her daughter had never seen before. And Jack Blackwood waited for them on the porch of their new house, ready to welcome them into a life that would be different from anything they had known before, but filled with possibilities that seemed to stretch as wide as the Dakota sky above them. 6 months later, Sarah Running Bear stood in the doorway of the high school gymnasium, clutching her diploma with hands that trembled slightly with pride and disbelief. She had done it, completed all the credits she needed to graduate, despite having dropped out 2 years earlier to help support her family. The past half year, the Blackwood Ranch had transformed their lives in ways that still seemed almost magical to Sarah. Tommy was thriving in the town school, making friends and bringing home report cards that filled Marie with pride. He had grown taller and stronger, and the serious illness that had nearly killed him seemed like a distant memory. Marie had blossomed in her role as Jack's housekeeper and cook, taking pride in managing the large ranch house and discovering talents she never knew she possessed. She experimented with recipes, tended a garden that produced vegetables for the entire ranch, and gradually took on more responsibilities as Jack came to trust her judgment completely. And Sarah herself had thrown herself into her studies with a determination that impressed her teachers and surprised even herself. She attended classes during the day and worked with the horses in the afternoons, discovering that she had a natural gift for training the young colts that Jack bred and sold to other ranchers. The changes hadn't come without challenges. There were people in town who looked askance at the Indian family living on the prestigious Blackwood Ranch, and Sarah had encountered her share of prejudice and suspicion from classmates and teachers who questioned whether she belonged in their school. But Jack's quiet support and her own determination had carried her through the difficult moments. Now, as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Sarah could see her family in the audience. Marie beaming with pride, Tommy bouncing excitedly in his seat, and her grandmother, who had made the trip from the reservation to witness this milestone. And there, sitting slightly apart but applauding as enthusiastically as any parent, was Jack Blackwood. After the ceremony, Jack approached the family with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "Congratulations, Sarah. You should be very proud of yourself." "Thank you," Sarah replied, still hardly able to believe that this day had actually come. "For everything. None of this would have been possible without your help." "You did the work," Jack said firmly. "I just provided the opportunity. The rest was all you." Tommy tugged on Jack's sleeve, demanding attention in a way that 8-year-olds always did. "Jack, Sarah's going to college now, right? That's what she told me." Jack looked at Sarah with raised eyebrows. "Is that true? Have you decided about college?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had been accepted to the state university with a partial scholarship, but there were still costs that her family couldn't afford. She had been trying to figure out how to bring up the subject with Jack without sounding like she was asking for more help. "I was accepted," she admitted, "but the scholarship doesn't cover everything, and I don't want to put more burden on our family." "What do you want to study?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Veterinary medicine," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she talked about her dream. "I want to come back here and help the animals on the reservation and the surrounding ranches. There's only one vet for hundreds of miles, and he's getting older." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "That's a worthy goal. Have you applied for other scholarships?" "A few, but Most of them have requirements I don't meet, or they're for amounts that wouldn't make much difference. Marie stepped forward, her expression determined. Sarah, tell Mr. Blackwood about the letter from the university. The one you've been carrying around for weeks. Sarah reluctantly reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. They offer me a full scholarship, she said quietly. Academic merit, with a preference for students from underrepresented communities who want to pursue careers in rural veterinary medicine. Jack's face broke into a wide grin. Sarah, that's wonderful. Why do you look like it's bad news? Because it means leaving for 4 years, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. And then veterinary school after that. It means abandoning my family when they finally found stability. Oh, sweetheart, Marie said, reaching out to take her daughter's hands. Is that what you've been worrying about? We don't need you to take care of us anymore. We're doing fine on our own. More than fine, Jack added. Your mother has become absolutely indispensable around the ranch. I've been meaning to talk to her about expanding her responsibilities and giving her a significant raise. Sarah looked at her family, her mother confident and capable in ways she had never been when they lived on the reservation. Tommy healthy and happy and full of dreams about his own future, her grandmother nodding with approval at this talk of education and advancement. What if things change while I'm gone? Sarah asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if this all falls apart and you need me? Things will change, Jack said gently, but not in the ways you're afraid of. Your mother has proven herself invaluable, and she's earned her place here through hard work and competence. This isn't charity anymore, Sarah. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement between employer and employee. He paused, looking at Sarah with the same serious expression she remembered from their first meeting by the creek. But more than that, your family has become important to me, not as employees but as friends. I'm not going to abandon people I care about, regardless of what the future brings. Tommy, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention that children sometimes showed, suddenly piped up with his own observation. Sarah, you have to go to college, he said matter-of-factly. You're too smart to stay here, and just take care of horses forever. And when you become an animal doctor, you can come back and help all the sick animals around here. From the mouths of babes, Sarah thought, looking at her little brother with new appreciation for his wisdom. Her grandmother spoke up for the first time since the ceremony, her voice carrying the weight of years and experience. Education is something no one can take away from you, she said in English, speaking slowly but clearly. It travels with you wherever you go, and it opens doors that stay closed to others. Your ancestors fought to give you this chance. Don't waste it out of fear. That evening, the family and Jack gathered at the ranch house for a celebration dinner that Marie had spent days planning. She had prepared Sarah's favorite foods alongside dishes that reflected both her Lakota heritage and the broader American culture that Sarah would be entering as a college student. As they sat around the large dining room table, sharing stories and laughter, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate teenager searching for herbs to save her dying brother. Now she was a high school graduate preparing for college and a career that would let her help animals and families throughout the region. I want to make a toast, Jack said, raising his glass of wine, sparkling cider for Tommy and Sarah, to new beginnings, to the courage to chase dreams, and to the family that has brought more joy to this ranch than they could possibly know. As they clinked glasses, Sarah felt tears threatening again, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. She had learned that sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from careful planning, but from unexpected encounters that shifted everything in ways you never could have imagined. After dinner, as Marie and Tommy helped clear the table, Jack asked Sarah to walk with him on the porch. They settled into rocking chairs and looked out over the ranch where cattle grazed peacefully in the evening light. I have something for you, Jack said, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out an envelope. Consider it a graduation gift. Sarah opened the envelope and found a check made out to her in an amount that made her gasp. It was enough to cover all her college expenses for the first year, with money left over for books and living expenses. Jack, I can't accept this, she said, trying to hand the envelope back to him. You've already done too much for us. Sarah, Jack said, his voice gentle but firm, 6 months ago, you saved my life in ways you don't even realize. This ranch was just a business to me before your family came here. Now it's a home. You gave me that gift without even trying. Let me give you this one in return." Sarah looked at the check again, then at Jack's sincere face. "How did I save your life?" Jack was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky. "I was becoming like my father," he said finally. "Successful but isolated, wealthy but empty. I had everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered. Your family reminded me that there are more important things than profit margins and property values." He turned to look at her directly. "You reminded me what it feels like to be part of something bigger than myself, to care about people's welfare more than my own convenience. That's not something you can put a price on." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she understood what Jack was trying to tell her. The relationship between their families had evolved from rescue to employment to something much deeper, a chosen family that transcended the traditional boundaries of race and class and circumstance. "What will happen while I'm away at college?" she asked. "Life will go on," Jack said with a smile. "Tommy will grow up and probably drive us all crazy with his questions about everything. Your mother will continue to amaze me with her competence and kindness. And I'll write you letters telling you about all the animals that need a good veterinarian to look after them. And when you come back, there will be a place for you here if you want it. Not because you're family employees, but because you're family. The kind you choose rather than the kind you're born into." That night, Sarah lay in her comfortable bed in the house that had become home, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Through her window, she could see lights in the main house where Jack was probably reading or working on ranch business. Down the hall, she could hear Tommy's steady breathing and her mother moving quietly through her bedtime routine. In the morning, she would call the university and accept the scholarship. In a few months, she would leave for college, taking with her the love and support of the family that had embraced her and the education that would prepare her for the career she had always dreamed of pursuing. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply rest in the peace of a life that had been transformed by unexpected kindness. The girl who had cried out for help beside a creek had been rescued in ways that went far beyond the immediate danger she had faced. She had been given the chance to become the person she was meant to be, and the courage to reach for dreams that had once seemed impossibly distant. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah thought about the threads that connected all the moments of her story, the desperation that had driven her to search for healing herbs, the kindness that had prompted Jack to help a stranger in trouble, the trust that had allowed her family to accept help from an unlikely source, and the love that had grown between people who had every reason to remain strangers. Sometimes, she reflected, the most beautiful things in life came from the most difficult beginnings. And sometimes, when you cried out for help in your darkest moment, the universe sent exactly the right person to hear you and respond with the kind of generosity that changed everything. The future stretched ahead of her like the vast Dakota sky, full of possibilities, challenges, and opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came next, Sarah knew she would face it with the strength that came from being truly loved and the confidence that came from knowing she had earned her place in the world through her own hard work and determination. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she carried the memory of a moment by a creek when a stranger had ridden down a bank to help a frightened girl, setting in motion a chain of events that had transformed multiple lives in ways that none of them could have predicted. It was a reminder that kindness was always a choice, and that choosing to help someone in need could lead to blessings you never saw coming. 8 years later, Dr. Sarah Running Bear Blackwood drove her veterinary truck down the familiar dirt road leading to the ranch that had been her home for most of her adult life. The late afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and she could see the horses in the near paddock lifting their heads to watch her approach. So much had changed since she left for college, yet the essential heart of the place remained the same. She had graduated from veterinary school with honors and had spent the past 2 years working with an established practice in Colorado, gaining experience and confidence before returning home to start her own clinic. The house where her family lived looked exactly as she remembered it, with the addition of a small greenhouse that Tommy had built for their mother's expanding garden. Marie's flowers and vegetables now supplied not only the ranch but several restaurants in town, and she had developed quite a reputation for her organic produce. Tommy, now 16 and nearly as tall as Jack, came bounding out of the barn when he heard her truck. He had grown into a confident young man who worked on the ranch after school, and during summers, learning the business from the ground up while maintaining his own dreams of attending agricultural college. "Sarah," he called out, grinning widely as she climbed out of the truck. "I knew you were coming today, but I didn't know exactly when. Jack's been checking the road every hour since noon." Sarah laughed and hugged her little brother, who was no longer little at all. "How's everything been going? Your letters never tell me enough details." "Busy," Tommy replied. "Calving season was rough this year. We lost 3 calves to that late snowstorm. And Jack's been talking about expanding the horse breeding program, especially if you're really going to set up your practice here." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jack appeared in the doorway of the main house. At 45, he had acquired a few gray threads in his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of working outdoors. But his smile was exactly as warm as Sarah remembered. "Welcome home, Dr. Blackwood," he said, and Sarah felt her heart skip slightly at hearing her new name spoken aloud. The wedding had been 6 months ago, a small ceremony held on the ranch with only their closest friends and family present. It had taken years for both Sarah and Jack to acknowledge the feelings that had developed between them as she grew from a frightened teenager into a confident young woman. The age difference and the circumstances of their meeting had made the relationship complicated, but the love that had grown between them was genuine and deep. "It's good to be home," Sarah replied, walking into Jack's embrace. "Though I have to admit, I'm nervous about starting the clinic." "You'll be wonderful," Jack said confidently. "The entire county has been waiting for you to come back. Old Doc Miller is thrilled to finally have someone to share the workload." Sarah's clinic was set to open the following Monday in a building that Jack had renovated specifically for her practice. It was located halfway between the ranch and the reservation, making it accessible to both the livestock owners and the families who kept horses, cattle, and other animals on tribal land. Marie appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel and beaming with pride at her daughter. "Welcome home, sweetheart. I made all your favorite foods, and your grandmother is driving over from the reservation for dinner." The evening was perfect in ways that Sarah had dreamed about during her years away at school. The family gathered around the same dining room table where they had celebrated her high school graduation, sharing stories and laughter while the sun set over the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. Sarah's grandmother, now in her 80s but still sharp and opinionated, regaled them with stories about the changes on the reservation. A new tribal council had been elected, bringing fresh ideas about economic development and education. Several young people from the community had followed Sarah's example and pursued higher education, returning home with skills and knowledge that benefited the entire tribe. "You started something," her grandmother told Sarah as they sat on the porch after dinner. "When you went away to school and came back as a doctor, it showed other young people that it was possible to leave and still come home. That education could be a bridge rather than a barrier." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she understood what her grandmother was telling her. Her own journey had become a model for others, proving that it was possible to honor your heritage while also embracing new opportunities. "I was scared the whole time," Sarah admitted. "Scared that I wouldn't be smart enough, scared that I didn't belong, scared that I would forget where I came from." "Fear is normal," her grandmother said wisely, "but you didn't let it stop you. And now look what you've built, a career that lets you help your community, a marriage that brings 2 families together, and a future that honors both your past and your dreams." The next morning, Sarah drove to her new clinic for a final walkthrough before opening day. The building was small, but efficiently designed, with examination rooms, a surgery suite, and space for boarding animals that needed extended care. Jack had spared no expense in equipping the facility, and Sarah felt a surge of excitement as she imagined all the animals she would be able to help. Dr. Miller, the elderly veterinarian who had served the area for 40 years, arrived to help her set up her equipment and go over the appointment schedule for the coming weeks. He was a kind man who had immediately welcomed Sarah when she expressed interest in practicing in the area, and he had been instrumental in helping her establish relationships with local ranchers and farmers. "You'll have quite a mix of cases," he told her as they arranged surgical instruments in the sterilization unit. "Everything from routine vaccinations to emergency surgery to pregnancy checks for prize breeding cattle. And don't be surprised if you get calls at all hours. Animals don't follow a normal business schedule." Sarah nodded, remembering the middle-of-the-night emergencies she had handled during her training. "I'm ready for that. I grew up around here, so I understand the rhythms of ranch life." That's one of the things that makes you perfect for this job, Dr. Miller said. You understand the people as well as the animals. That makes all the difference in rural veterinary practice. On Monday morning, Sarah's first official patient was a horse with a suspected broken leg. The animal belonged to a young family on the reservation who had saved for months to buy their first horse, only to have it injured in a fence accident 2 days after they brought it home. Sarah examined the mare carefully, using x-rays to determine the extent of the injury. The break was clean and in a location that would heal well with proper treatment, though the cost of surgery and recovery would be significant. Can she be saved? The father asked anxiously, while his 2 young children peered over the stall door with worried faces. Yes, Sarah said firmly. It will take time and careful management, but she should heal completely. Let me talk to you about payment options. Sarah had worked with Jack to establish a sliding fee scale that would make her services accessible to families with limited income. For cases like this, where people had invested their savings in an animal that was important to their livelihood or their children's happiness, she was prepared to work out payment plans that wouldn't create financial hardship. The surgery went smoothly, and by that afternoon, the mare was standing quietly in a recovery stall while her young owners took turns feeding her carrots and whispering encouragement. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction as she watched the family's relief and gratitude, knowing that she had helped preserve something important to them. Her second case of the day was a Holstein cow belonging to one of the larger dairy operations in the county. The animal was having difficulty calving, and the farmer was worried about losing both the cow and her calf. This time, Sarah found herself working in a modern barn with state-of-the-art equipment, but the essential challenge was the same: using her skills to preserve life and prevent suffering. By the end of her first week, word had spread throughout the community about the young veterinarian who combined excellent technical skills with genuine compassion for both animals and their owners. Sarah's appointment book was filling rapidly, and she found herself working the long hours that she had expected, but loving every minute of it. The most meaningful moment came on Friday evening, when she received an emergency call about a dog that had been hit by a car on the reservation. The animal belonged to an elderly man who lived alone and depended on his border collie for companionship and help managing his small herd of sheep. When Sarah arrived at the scene, she found the dog badly injured but still alive. The owner, a weathered man in his 70s, knelt beside his companion with tears streaming down his face. "Please," he said in Lakota, then switched to English when he realized who she was. "Please save him. He's all I have left." Sarah worked for 3 hours in her clinic that night, repairing internal injuries and setting broken bones while the old man waited anxiously in the reception area. The surgery was touch and go, requiring all of her training and experience, but finally, the dog's vital signs stabilized. "He's going to make it," she told the owner, who collapsed in his chair with relief. "But he'll need several weeks of rest and careful monitoring." "I can pay," the man said, reaching for a wallet that Sarah suspected contained every dollar he had in the world. "Maybe not all at once, but I can pay." Sarah looked at this proud man who was offering to sacrifice everything he had to save his beloved companion, and she thought about another desperate person who had once cried out for help beside a creek. Sometimes the most important payment for service was simply knowing that you had made a difference in someone's life. "Let's talk about that after he's fully recovered," she said gently. "Right now, the important thing is getting him healthy again." A month later, Sarah received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a beautiful beadwork belt with traditional Lakota designs, along with a note written in careful English. "For the veterinarian who understands that all creatures deserve healing. From a grateful old man and his grateful dog." That evening, Sarah showed the belt to Jack as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. They had been married for almost a year now, and she was still amazed by how perfectly their lives had fit together. Jack understood her commitment to her work and supported her desire to serve both the wealthy ranchers and the struggling families in the community. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you felt like," she told him, fingering the intricate beadwork. "When you help my family, I mean, the feeling of knowing you've made a real difference in someone's life." Jack smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. "It's addictive, isn't it? That feeling of being useful in the most fundamental way possible. Is that why you've been talking to Tommy about college?" Sarah asked. She had noticed Jack having serious conversations with her brother about agricultural programs and livestock management degrees. "Tommy has a good mind for the business side of ranching," Jack replied. And he has insights about sustainable practices that I never would have thought of. If he gets the right education, he could transform not just our operation, but the entire industry in this area. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride as she thought about her little brother's potential future. He would have opportunities that previous generations of her family could never have imagined, but he would also have the wisdom to use those opportunities in ways that honored his heritage and helped his community. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened teenager who had once gathered herbs beside a creek had become a woman who could heal animals, support her family, and serve her community in ways that made a genuine difference. But more than that, she had learned that kindness was a force that multiplied when it was shared. Jack's decision to help a stranger in trouble had created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate family. Tommy would likely go on to become a leader in sustainable agriculture. Other young people from the reservation were pursuing their own dreams of education and professional careers. And Sarah herself was now in a position to help other families facing the kinds of emergencies that had once threatened to destroy her own. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, noticing her thoughtful silence. "About how everything connects," Sarah replied. "How one act of kindness can change not just one life, but generations of lives. How helping one person can create a chain reaction of healing and hope." Jack squeezed her shoulder gently. "Your grandmother was right about the spirits sending help in unexpected forms. Sometimes I think we were all meant to find each other, to become the family we needed rather than just the family we were born into." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the lights twinkle on across the valley, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The girl who had once cried out for help had grown into a woman who could answer those cries for others. The desperate search for healing that had brought her to the creek where she met Jack had led to a life dedicated to healing in all its forms. And somewhere out there, she knew, there were other young people facing their own desperate moments, their own impossible choices, their own cries for help. But now she was part of the network of people who could hear those cries and respond with the kind of life-changing kindness that created new possibilities where none had existed before. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Every animal she healed, every family she helped, every crisis she resolved would create new opportunities for kindness to multiply and spread. And someday, the children whose pets she saved or whose livestock she protected might grow up to become the healers and helpers and hope bringers for the next generation of people in need. As Sarah and Jack made their way inside for the night, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to her ancestors and to whatever forces had brought them all together. The ranch was quiet now, with only the gentle sounds of animals settling down for the night and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. But in that quietness, Sarah could hear something else, the echo of her own voice from years ago, crying out for help beside a creek, and the thundering response of hoofbeats that had changed everything. It was a reminder that miracles often came disguised as ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and that sometimes the most powerful healing happened not through medicine or surgery, but through the simple decision to care about someone else's pain and do something to alleviate it. The future stretched ahead of them all,